What up, everybody? Welcome to another episode of Ask Paul. My name is Paul Abernathy, your host for this podcast, and thanks for taking the time out of your day to join me on Ask Paul, available at paulabernathy.com, where you can ask all of your National Electrical Code questions and get answers to those questions via email, obviously, and as well, your question could be selected for an upcoming edition of Ask Paul. So on today's episode, we're going to answer a couple questions. These are probably very simple questions, but again, we want to make sure that we cover the questions that people send in. And of course, we might be able to cover more than a couple if they're pretty short and straightforward type answers. All right. So the first question that we received was from somebody. Oh, I should mention, if you haven't checked out all of our swag, all of our shirts and logos and t-shirts and mugs and all different types of stuff that we have over at Electrician Pride. Check it out. It helps support us. It helps support the shows, but it also has some really neat trade specific Pride type of logos. Master Electrician. We have the Warrior, the Code Strong, and all that kind of stuff. So I'm going to run that commercial. And then I want you to check it out when you get some chance. Electrician Pride, PRIDE.com. Give them a check. So we're going to run this, and then I'll get into today's show. Today's show is sponsored by electricianpride.com, your one-stop shop for electrician-specific t-shirts, hoodies, phone cases, mugs, die-cut stickers, leggings, and so much more. Featuring unique designs for electricians, journeymen, and master electricians, as well as electrical engineers and electrical inspectors. For more information on all the products that are available, visit us at www.electricianpride.com today. All right, so get a chance, go check it out. Really great items. All the t-shirts are Glidden. They're pretty good quality. I've got obviously a selection of my own. And others have got them as well. And we have some great embroidery products over there as well. So Master Electrician, we have the Zeus. So anyway, check that out. We'd love to have you get something from our website and share the pride. All right, on today's episode, we got the first question that we're going to look at was submitted. And it's a pretty basic question, but again, we like to, no question is too simple. We want to make sure that people get the answers that they are looking for. So the question is, Paul, when calculating a dwelling unit electrical service, do you add the basement if it's unfinished, but they plan to finish it in the future? Okay. So, on the surface, when I saw this, I was thinking, well, this is, pretty simple question. And something that people have to think about, because there are a lot of dwellings that are getting wired and you're doing the calculation for it and you have a basement that is unfinished. However, we have to understand the language that's in the National Electrical Code. So if you're in the 2017 edition of the National Electrical Code, you're going to kind of migrate to 220.12. And if you're in the 2020 edition of the NEC, you're going to look at 220.11. And 220.11 is new for the 2020 cycle, but it's just regurgitated information, right? And it talks about the floor area and how you do the calculations. Now, we are going to ultimately be at, again, 3 VA per square foot because it is a dwelling unit. It's just the unfinished basement portion. But understanding what gets included is real important. So if we look at 220.11, the floor area, it says, quote, the floor area of each floor shall be calculated from the outside dimensions of the building, dwelling unit, or other area involved. The dwelling unit, the calculated floor area shall not include open porches, garages, or unused or unfinished spaces. Now, this is the most important part. It says not adaptable for future use. Of course, an unfinished basement is adaptable for future use. So when you're doing your per floor square footage area, 3 VA, if it's a 2-story building, a 2-story dwelling, and you have the basement portion unfinished, then you're going to do the outside dimensions of each floor, and you're going to factor that in your 3 VA per square foot as you do your overall calculation. Okay. So hopefully that answers that question for you. You're most certainly going to consider it. Now, many people confuse when it says unused or unfinished space is not adaptable for future use. This is a great example of this is you might have a really high attic space, but it's not designed to support load. The trusses or how it's designed, that's not really adaptable for future use, even though people do things and we know they do. It's not really adaptable for future use, especially if it's like a scuttle hole, that space, you wouldn't count that space. I mean, that's a no-brainer. But you could have a space with pull-down stairs that you might have adequacy for some storage, but it is not adaptable for future use. And so those type of things means you would not consider that as a 3 VA per square foot for that space. As always, check with your HJ, look and see what the house is designed, and look at those spaces. Communicate with your authority having jurisdiction. If there is a question, always want to check with them. You know, at the end of the day, they hold all the end cards when it comes to what's acceptable and what's not. But the code is pretty clear. If it's not adaptable for future use, then it does not have to get included in that 3 VA per square foot. So hopefully I answered that question for you. So go check 220.11. And if you're in the 2017, go check 220.12. And if you're in 220.11 in the 2020 edition, you're also going to jump down and look at 220.14 as well. And there's different ones there, but you're going to go to the one that deals with dwelling units. Okay. I believe it's J. Don't hold me to that. All right. So the next one that we have submitted, and the next one says, okay, I have a question. It says, Paul, if there's a 200 amp service, but the known load is only 100 amperes, do you size the wire for 100 amps or 200 amps? Okay, so in this question, you already told me that it's a 200 amp service. So you're going to size everything for 200 amps. Now, your calculated load here might be only 100 amperes. Okay. But if it's a 200 amp service, I'm going to size it for 200 amps. If it was only 100 amps of calculated load, then you could have done a 100 amp service and you size the wire accordingly. But for me, if it's going to be a 200 amp service, then I am going to size the conductors for a 200 amp service because you stated it was a 200 amp service. If you size the conductors only for 100, but the service is rated for 200, then you have a problem if they add additional loads here, because they're not sizing the conductors accordingly. Now, if all the rules apply in 310.12, which is that 83% rule, then you have conductors that have to be at least 83% of the service rating. And that's based on the overcurrent device that you do based on a calculated load. You do have some smaller conductor allowances there. But at the end of the day, based on your question, since you say it's a 200 amp service, your calculated load was only 100 amperes. If you put in a 200 amp service, I would size the conductors for the 200 amp service. Okay. Get all the capacity you could get out there. Okay. But at the end of the day, you can always have something that's larger, but when it comes to the service, if the conductors are only rated for 100 amps and you have a 200 amp rated service, then it's not adequately protecting those service conductors, at least from an overload condition. Obviously, service conductors can't be protected from a short circuiting ground fault condition, but you still have to protect it from an overload position. And again, other than the 83% and those allowances, sizing conductors at 100 amperes and having a 200 amp main disconnect, for example, would not be advisable. Yeah, others may disagree with that, but that would not be advisable in that application. Okay. All right. What other questions do we have? Let's see. The next question that we have is, Paul, what would be the working clearance if there was a metal fence in front of a 300 volt panel? Okay. So odd question because I'm not aware of a 300 volt panel. It would be 12240, 12208. It would be 480. It would be, 208. I'm not familiar with the 300 volt panel. Okay. But let's just talk in general what you would do. So you're talking about working clearance and you have the fence. The first thing is you got to make sure that fence is not going to be impeding the ability for somebody to safely work on a piece of equipment. So you've got all the rules that you have to follow that you're all probably very, very familiar with when it comes to working clearance, right? You have to have those working clearances in place, and you got to make sure that you're not going to have anything that's going to impinge on that working. So what are we talking about? We're talking about 110.26. All right. So I did get another kind of a related question that somebody asked me. It was based on a Fast Tracks program where they debated a question that's in our program, and I ended up having to explain to them. A lot of people read this table 110.26A1 and they forget the fact that if it's a 120 240 volt panel, for example, you're not using the 240 volts. That's phase to phase. You're using, as the table says, the nominal voltage to ground. That's what you're using. So in a 120 240, you're using the 120. That's the value. So in this case, he was arguing that it needed to be 3.5 feet because it was a 120 240 volt panel, and it was a condition where one of the side was grounded. And that would be like under condition number 2. One side of the working space has grounded parts. So anyway, it was condition 2, and he was arguing it was 3.5 feet. Reality, it's 0 to 150 volts to ground, and a 120 240 is 120 to ground. So it falls under that, and it would be 3 feet is your minimum working clearance. Okay, that's the minimum. You can always exceed the minimum and go greater, but that's the minimum. So in this case right here, when this individual says 300 volt panel, the key in the question has to be, well, what is the voltage to ground? So if it's a 120 240, it's 120 to ground. If it's a 208 120, it's 120 to ground. If it's a 277 480, then it's 277 to ground. Then that's going to put you into this table, and you'll notice in this table, and for those that are following along, it is on page 50 of your National Electrical Code. Again, I'm using the 2020 edition. And you'll notice that it says 0 to 150. All of those conditions are 3 feet clearance. But 151 to 600, okay, that scenario, it would be 3 feet or 3.5 feet or even 4 feet based on the condition that's, and the notes below it will give you those conditions, okay? So in your case, 300 volts, I'm not aware of any voltage class for that. So you might want to rethink that concept that you're working on and kind of you'll go back and really learn some of the basics in how you look at something. But I'm going to assume in this case it was a 120 240, and you're going to be 120, so you're going to be 3 feet clearance on your question. If it was 300 volts to ground, I'm just going to go devil's advocate for your question. Then you would simply go to 151 through 600, and then based on the condition, it'd be 3 feet, 3.5 feet, or 4 feet based on your condition. And you didn't give any conditions, so you're going to have to look at condition 1, condition 2, and condition 3 and see which one is applicable to your question. And that's going to be where you go to find your working clearance. Okay. All right. So that's that one. Let's see if we have another question. Okay. See, the next question we have is from an individual who sent in a question and says, Paul, can you please explain the difference between a parallel and series arc and the difference between a dual function and a combination AFCI device? Okay, sure. That's, which sounds on the surface like a potentially complicated question, is really not, right? So the first thing that I tell students to do at this point, if they're in my program, is to go to 210.12. Obviously, 210.12 is what's going to be dealing with the AFCI's, arc fault circuit interrupters. And we've been dealing with the AFCI devices for quite a few years now. Now, they're all governed under UL 1699. So that's the different various tests that have to be performed on it. And all of the manufacturers have to comply with this. Now, various manufacturers comply with this in many ways, different, as long as the end result is compliant with 1699, then they're okay. So back in the day, there used to be an integrated GFI, for example, function in all of these AFCIs that worked in conjunction with the AFCI arc detection function characteristics. And over the years, some people have removed that out because their characteristics and how they detect it and everything has evolved. And so they removed that function. And there's plenty of people out there that believe that was a mistake, that removing any GFI or GFCI function actually caused more of a problem with these AFCI devices when it comes to things like glowing arcs and whatnot. Again, I'm not going to debate either one of those on today's Ask Paul episode. I do that plenty in some of my other stuff. But we want to kind of dig down into a little bit of the history of AFCIs when it comes to the different devices. Now, the first thing, I'll answer the question, but the first thing that we have to remember that all of us that got introduced to AFCIs got introduced to what's called a branch and feeder type AFCI. Okay, that was the very first ones that we kind of got introduced to, and they only are looking for a parallel arc. Okay, so this takes us into our first understanding of arc fault detection. So the most commonly first thought of arc that could take place is if you have two conductors that are running parallel. It could be an extension cord, it could be a non-metallic sheath cable, it could be whatever, and it could be flexible cord, whatnot. It's being used for something, but you have, let's just say for argument's sake, a black and a white conductor. Okay, so you've got one, again, it's alternating current, but for discussion's sake, you have the load and the currents going out are being drawn due to the load. You have on the hot conductor and it is coming back on the neutral. Again, we know that it's changing, it's alternating current, but for argument's sake, we have a completed circuit, a black and a white. And what happens is if you have damage across those conductors, then it causes basically a short between the grounded and ungrounded conductor. However, it's not at a point where it's going to actually trip any overcurrent device. I mean, it could, but it could be in a case where it's just an arc where the characteristics of that arc creates a loading effect, and the typical breaker would not see this as a problem, right? So but the arcing could continue on and on and on until the level of the arc gets to a certain temperature. That pyrolyzation of material around it could cause a fire. So these AFCI devices were looking for this characteristic, this signature arc, and it isn't without issue, okay? It isn't without other things potentially, which is more driven towards the frequencies than it is about the arc characteristic. That's where you see things like Hunter fans in the past and vacuum cleaners and all this kind of stuff. It was more about a frequency, which is loosely governed by FCC. But at the end of the day, that's more of why you had this, what people would call nuisance tripping scenario. It didn't mean that the FCI wasn't functionable. It just means there was something that was causing it to trip, and the manufacturers need to deal with that. Okay. And you know, hopefully they are dealing with it, or at least attempting to deal with it. So as we've evolved with these things, originally we're looking at this arc, and this arc characteristic between two conductors could come from somebody driving a staple too tight, could come from somebody shutting a cord up in the doorway, running cords through windows and slamming them, in a potential there for an arc, but not enough that it would clear a standard overcurrent device. Okay, it just basically acts like a load, a resistance. And so the AFCIs came about, and again, I'm talking about this at a 30,000 foot level. So they came out with this branch feeder style, and it was only looking for parallel arc condition. Well, they realized that you could also have a serious problem with something called a series arc. Now, what is a series arc, and how does it differ from the parallel? Well, obviously, parallel is self-explanatory, two conductors running parallel. And it's a condition that is not load specific. So whatever the load is at the end of this black and white, for example, is irrelevant to the fact that the arc is bridging across the two conductors anywhere in the branch circuit or feeder application. Well, when it comes to series arcs, it's different, because a series arc is very dependent on the load itself. If there's no load, then there's no current transfer, right? It's kind of like if you have a switch in there and the switch is off. If you have the issue downstream of the switch and there's no current flowing because it's an open circuit, then you have no condition to really worry about. It's not going to surface itself until a load passes through the circuit. So it was thought that was very load dependent, and that those arcs weren't that big of an issue, or we didn't have the technology to be able to test that. And the branch and feeder don't look for series arcs. They look for parallel arcs. So what happened is we realized that poor terminations at screws, not torquing properly, conductors that have been damaged, let's say the entire hot's been damaged and it's just barely touching or something. And so when it's okay until current flows because of the load, then you've got current wanting to complete that circuit, then what happens is you create an arc right there at that series break or that series poor termination. And it ends up, because of the arc trying to complete that circuit, it's, again, all about proximity. So it could be just if the conductors were far apart, then you're not going to get that bridge. There's not enough there, enough medium, enough gas, there's not anything there to help bridge that gap, okay? But usually these damaged pieces are in close proximity where the arcing can be sustained through air across these 2 points. And if that's the case, the arc over time will do just like an arc does, generate heat and cause a problem either at the terminals, melting down the receptacle or the switch because of poor termination and loads passing through this poor connection. Obviously, it can handle it with a damaged conductor in a cable as well. And so in this case, it was a condition, and that's where series AFCI technology was drafted out, and 1699 deals with that. And so you have both series and parallel arcing characteristics. Now, the branch feeder and the branch and feeder AFCIs are still being utilized in the NEC under 210.12, but you have caveats to that. But what happened was they created what's called a combination AFCI. And a combination AFCI is exactly how it sounds. It combines the technology to detect both parallel and series arcs. And that's what a combination is. Okay. Now, in that same conversation, there's a such thing as what's called a dual function type device. Now, I always tell students, because again, inadvertently, I do this at a lot of seminars. I'll ask people, do they know the difference? And the room gets kind of quiet. I know there's some people that know, they just don't want to say anything because they don't want to be, everybody's kind of they're not real fond of making statements and then in the middle of a room of a bunch of people and then be wrong. And then they got to sit there feeling like all these eyes are staring at them. So I get it. I've always never worried about that. I don't mind being that guy. But at the end of the day, the problem is that a dual function is a actual dual function, not a combination which is looking for characteristics. A dual function is two separate functions. And if you think about it that way, it's easier to remember. So dual function is not only looking for AFCI characteristics, that is series and parallels, but it's also a GFCI function. So it can be utilized for things like GFCI requirements in 210.8. Of course, inadvertently, you're going to have situations in your dwelling, for example, where you're going to have GFCI protection as well as AFCI protection, just like in a kitchen, for example. So there's many ways that you can do it. 210.12 gives us ways to do this in a dwelling unit. And of course, it's not just dwelling units. Of course, you know that it's also now migrated to things like dormitory units, guest rooms, and guest suites. And then, of course, the patient sleeping of a nursing home or limited care facility. And it's expanding again in the 2023 edition of the NEC, okay, for the sleeping areas for things like ambulatory police stations, things like that, where people could sleep. So it's expanding. But you really, it's important to understand the different options you have. Now, let's just talk about two different applications for AFCI protection, because there is other ones in here, but you're probably going to follow on two lines of protection for AFCIs, okay, for the answer to the question. So 210.12a tells you the locations where you would have AFCI protection. And this is very much branch circuit driven, okay, so it's 120 volt, all right? So what you'll see is you have option number 1 and option number 2, which by far is going to be the choices that most people are probably going to make. Number 1 option is a limited combination type arc fault circuit interrupter installed to provide protection of the entire branch circuit right at the source. Everything downstream will be protected from AFCI, have AFCI protection right at the source. Okay. Now, that's probably the easiest way to do it. And obviously in new construction, it's, they make these AFCI combination devices for every manufacturer makes one. So again, new installations, not a problem. Old installations could be a problem. So you do have options like the receptacle device style, but easiest option here, and I'm not saying this in preference to the circuit breaker manufacturers. I'm just saying it's the easiest opportunity that you're going to have is to do it this way. Put the breaker in the panel. Okay. As an electrician, I'm not really care about the manufacturers. They're gonna hate that statement because they fight all the time. But as an electrician, I don't give a darn. I just want to meet the code. That's it. And as that's the easiest way for me to do it, I'm going to do it. All right. Number 2, it says a listed branch feeder type AFCI. And you remember what we said here? A branch feeder type AFCI was what we originally had. And then it kind of, for a cycle, it went away saying, nah, you can't use it. They all have to be combination. And then it came back again in the 2017, I believe. Don't hold me to that. But it was briefly removed prior. And it's like, okay, those have been around. We're going to let you use it. It's fine. You can use a branch feeder type AFCI. But again, remember, it's only going to give parallel protection. So there's going to be caveats you have to follow. So if you want to use these, okay, and I'll be honest with you, I don't know the price differences between picking up some branch feeder type AFCIs versus combination. I do know, for example, a lot of electricians might have still had some of the old branch feeders hanging around. And then when the code changed a little bit, you couldn't use them. So they're like, well, what do I do with them? And then now when it came back, you at least had another use for these products. So it actually breathed new life into these branch feeder styles. So here's what it says you can do. If you want to use these, it says a branch feeder type AFCI installed at the origin of the branch circuit. Okay, so back in the panel. In combination with a listed outlet branch circuit type AFCI installed at the first outlet box on the branch circuit. Okay, so if you want to use, now this is why it makes it probably not the practical solution for people. Because you unless you just happen to have the branch feeder type AFCIs handy, just, you had them on the trucks for years and you're like, okay, I still got them. Then you still got to go out and you got to buy the outlet type AFCI that goes in the outlet. So the device. Okay. So you've got to get 2. So you're still going to have to go buy one. So when you look at the cost, that's when you start to say, okay, do I even want to do that? I'm just going to look and see what a combination one costs. So it says, so you have to install it in the first outlet. And it says, the first outlet box on the branch circuit shall be marked to indicate that it is the first outlet of the circuit. Okay. So those are the 2 main options you're probably going to fall. I mean, you do have 4 other ways to do this that I'll let y'all just go over. But to answer the question, I explained what the characteristics are very loosely. Okay, I'll have somebody from a manufacturer say, thumbs down, that's not, but again, I'm trying to keep it at a 30,000 foot basic understanding level. And probably the most prominent aspect that the questioner, is going to run into is, do I choose a combination type? Okay, and that's what I run, and that's what I put in as a breaker, and it protects everything. Or do I have a situation where I need, and this is what Jay does, if y'all familiar with Jay Grunberg, the Basement King, who's over on our Electrician Live episode, which you should tune into every Thursday evening at 8 p.m. Central Standard Time. Me and Jay have a great time. We have a lot of special guests that'll be coming up in the future, so make sure you check that out. But in his case, he's like, well, if I've got to provide GFCI protection and I've got to provide AFCI protection, why don't I just get a dual function? I started to say it, folks. Why don't I just get a dual function and it covers both things? Well, you know what? You have to look at that and say, well, if it's a kitchen circuit, let's say for the countertop, let's say a small appliance, you got to think, okay, well, if I put an AFCI in the panel, and then I can get a GFCI device to put at the first receptacle on the countertop, and of course it protects everything downstream from it, then what is the cost? So I've got to buy a AFCI combination, and then I buy a GFCI device, and I'm out of touch with the current prices, but what is the cost of a dual function? And I get both of these. And so I guess the cost is pretty comparable because Jay likes to go with the dual functions all the time. So I guess if a savvy owner or savvy contractor is going to look at your best option, right? You're going to look and say, okay, well, if I'm buying a bunch of these, what's the best choice? I'm saving money if I buy the dual function, because everywhere that's required AFCI protection, I'm also going to have in many of those places GFCI requirements for protection. So maybe I'm killing two birds with one stone here. So you have to look at the pricing difference and how you want to do it. But you do have options. There's 6 different options in here. And so you can use that to meet your options. Again, I don't really, it doesn't matter to me which one you use, but that kind of just explains the 2 basic ones in that that we're dealing with. So hopefully that answered your question. I can't remember exactly what the question was, but I could go back and look. But I think you wanted to know the difference between series and parallels. And I went on and gave you some bonus information about your options between combination type, which is going to cover series and parallel arcs, and then dual function, which is AFCI and GFCI benefits, right? And then I explained the listed branch and feeder type, which was the first AFCI that ever came around, and how that only covers the parallel. Oh, I guess I should mention, if you use the option number 2 here, and you use a listed branch feeder, then your parallel protection is covered from the panel down to that first receptacle outlet that's going to be AFCI. That device downstream will cover parallel and series. And here's the thing. The actual receptacles type AFCI will cover any issues with series upstream to the actual source. So it's how you're able to do this. The breaker in the panel covers parallels downstream. The first AFCI device in the outlet will cover series upstream and both series and parallel downstream. That's how they work together, and that's why it's a option here in the National Electrical Code. Okay. Hopefully that explains that out to you. All right, last question we have, and this seems like this is not a code question. This is an exam prep problem somebody's having because it came in. It wasn't specifically code, so. It says, Paul, I'm having trouble passing my electrical exam. I purchased a library of products from a very popular educator, spent over $1,200, and I still can't seem to pass my exam. Okay. What advice can you give me to help me pass my electrical exam? Okay. I shudder to add this question again because, there's so many options out there, and there are really so many great educators, and they put out really good work. And the question is, it's probably not so much the educator's material. Code is code, right? Your problem that you're probably having, in my analysis of doing this over 30 years, and I would consider probably being an exam prep expert, if you will, rather than just course content creator, is that you probably don't have a study plan. The problem with a large volume of information is, one, you don't know where to go, where to start, where the key focuses are, and how you know how to actually set your study time up to be effective for you. That's probably the number one thing that I see with people is they don't know how to use their study time effectively. So shameless plug for my Fast Tracks program. When this was created, it was created in order to try to give structure to learning, not just to pass an exam, but really cover the core fundamental things that you need to know. The day in and day out things that, again, important for exams because it's usually low-hanging fruit on an exam, but also important to understand because these are real-world scenarios. And backing that up with great illustrations and great key focus call-outs, items, points, numbers that focus on certain things, that's what we do in our Fast Tracks program. Okay, so again, I'm not here to talk about anybody else's program. They all are great. I've seen them all. I've been involved with them. They're great. Code is code. All we do different in our Fast Tracks program is to provide it in a way that's a little bit more structured. And with the code questions and the competency reviews and the reading material and the graphics and the fact that you can join me on Wednesday nights and ask any question you want based on your studies. Plus, I do training on Wednesday nights. So basically, you're getting me as a tutor every week. And it's not part of the Fast Tracks program. It's something that I like to do for my students. And so I am about you succeeding. So that's why I created the Fast Tracks program. And that's why I utilize what I feel is one of the best publications out there. And that's Charles Miller's Illustrated Guidebook. We use that as our base and we build on top of that because, that is the greatest thing about a well planned out program is the base. What you're setting as the base. Does it cover everything? No. That's why we supplement it. We add things. We add videos. We add training. We add the question modules. All these type of things are to build on top of a solid foundation. And that's what you have to have. Along with that, we also give a study plan. Now, the study plan is free. You can download it from our website. Just go to the main website, masterthenec.com or electricalcodeacademy.com. Scroll down to the bottom. You'll see where it says 60-day or 90-day. It is designed to work with the Fast Tracks program because it talks about what you need to be doing from day one. And it's going to give you a certain number of practice exams that you need to do. You're not going to do them all. You're going to do the ones that it tells you, like the first week you do this, second week you do this. It's going to tell you the number of hours that you need to dedicate to your study. And that is done for two reasons. One, it's basically keeps you directly on pace with going from unit to unit to unit to unit to unit, which is what you need to do. You don't need to jump around. You stay focused. And two, what it's going to do is it's going to allow you to be able to grow within the system and send you down to do practice exams that are maybe there are going to be some questions that you aren't ready for yet because you're just starting the program, but that's okay because it allows you to answer questions and forces you to use your code book so that as you're jumping in and out of your work material and into the practice exams, you'll start to get a better understanding of navigating the NEC. So don't worry about your low scores on your practice exam to start out with, because I promise you the reason we do this is because we track the algorithm. And what we're going to see is your scores will start to go up. And so what we'll see is during the first couple practice exams, your scores will probably be pretty low because you just started the Fast Tracks program. But as you get further on in the program and you jump down and you're doing these practice exams, your scores, you start to see a graphing effect, whereas your scores start to come up. The amount of time that you spend in the program, the practice exams, because we track everything, start to go up. And what we do is we see the improvement of the student. And you'll see that it starts to get easier to answer the questions as you get further on. And remember, these practice exams, you can take them over and over again. They're not designed for one and done. I mean, you could take them over and over and over again. And it doesn't matter if it's the same questions because it will juggle them up. It's how you answer them. And we understand that you're getting better. You're getting in. And that's the other thing. We do what's called competency review. Now, no other program I'm aware of out there does this. And that is where you have to answer competency questions based on the material you just read. So in that scenario, you can use your code book. You can go back and use the reading material, whatever you need to do to answer these questions. It's not timed. Okay. You take your time, but you're trying to get scores that are above 85%. So in that scenario, you're learning, and it's a learning process, and nothing retained is gained overnight. It takes time. And that's why we created that program. So that's why, and again, we don't advertise. We're not in publications. We're not in ENCNM magazine. We're not paying for that. We're organic on the internet. We're shared by other electricians, other students. They go to social media. They share it. They say, look, I'm with you, brother. I feel your pain. You're trying to get your license. Check these folks out. So that's why I encourage everybody out there to share. Please share our Fast Tracks program. And you can find out more about it again at masterthenec.com or electricalcodeacademy.com/Fast Tracks program. Or you'll see it at the top of the website. It'll say exam preparation. That's the course. Give it a shot. If it sounds to me, this person that submitted this question, it sounds to me that you have a lot of material. The problem is you're not able to focus. That's a problem. And so at a third, if not greater than a third of the price, our Fast Tracks program with our study plan, following the units, there's 19 units. There's over 1,200 questions involved, both competency and practice. If you focus on them and you follow my plan and you join me on Wednesday nights, You will be successful. And I will see you get that license and you can go on to be successful and do all the things that you dreamed of doing. That's the difference. Studying with a plan. I didn't come up with this overnight, folks. I'm just not out there selling you a book and dropping you on your own. I'm not selling you DVDs and dropping you on your own. I'm not selling you an online course and dropping you without any support. Once I get your money and I'm gone. People that know me know that I am always here to answer questions. I do training every week for you as a supplement to your program. All you got to do is bring me your questions and I will explain them to you. There is nowhere else that you can do that. So I want you to be successful. So again, check out our Fast Tracks program. Hopefully that answered your question. Well, that's enough for this episode. I answered a bunch of questions and did a shameless plug at the end. But again, I'm really passionate about what I do. And I love seeing people succeed. The emails that I get each week are simply amazing. I get excited, especially when my students pass it. And I just recently, a student named Steve sent me an email and said, I could not have done it without your course. And I went into that exam and I nailed it. That's the difference. Our program, all online, interactive, and what we do basically removes the stress. So people that have trouble passing electrical exams, it's not because you don't know the material. It's because of the stress of an exam. Help me help you by being a Fast Track student, and I can help you succeed. So anyway, that's a shameless plug. Till next time, folks, stay safe. God bless. Until next time, remember, send your questions to www.paulabernathy.com, and I'm more than happy to try to answer your NEC code related questions.